What happens when your ship disappears under the ice, leaving you with 800 miles of a brutal, frozen ocean to cross? For Sir Ernest Shackleton's crew, that was not the end of their expedition. It was just the beginning of their journey. A journey into a world of breathtaking beauty and of unforgiving cold. This was Antarctica. As you get settled in, feel free to share in the comments below where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It is a wonderful thought, picturing us connected from all across the globe, all listening to the same story unfold. It reminds us that even across great distances, we can share in these moments of human history. So, find a comfortable spot and let the sounds of your world begin to fade. Tonight, we join the 28 men of the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition at the very moment of their greatest crisis. The year is 1915, and their ship, their only link to the entire outside world, is being swallowed whole by the ice. Their vessel was a magnificent thing, a ship built for the very edge of the world. She was constructed in Sandefjord, Norway, a place renowned for its master shipwrights. Her skeleton was made of Norwegian fir, and her outer sheath was green heart, one of the toughest woods known to man. But she was not originally built for this journey. She began her life named Polaris, designed not for a grueling scientific expedition, but for carrying wealthy tourists on polar cruises. She was meant for sightseeing, not survival. Shackleton, however, saw her strength and renamed her. He called her the Endurance. Her name would prove to be a prophecy. On the 19th of January in 1915, the Endurance became trapped. The pack ice of the Weddell Sea, a place notorious for its unpredictable and powerful currents, closed in around her hull. At first, it was a minor inconvenience, a delay. But days turned into weeks, and the weeks bled into months. The ship, once a powerful tool of exploration, was now a helpless prisoner, held fast in a white desert. For over 280 days, the Endurance and her crew drifted. They were carried along by the slow, immense, and irresistible movement of the ice floe. They traveled more than 1,500 miles, not toward their goal, but in a long, looping, aimless path dictated by the sea itself. The sun wheeled low in the sky, a pale disk in an endless expanse of white. The men adjusted. They played football on the ice. They cared for their dogs, and they waited. But the ice was not content to simply hold them. It began to squeeze. The pressure started as a low groan. A vibration felt deep in the bones, traveling up through the soles of their boots. Soon, the groaning grew into a roar. On the 27th of October, after 10 months of imprisonment, the ice began its final assault. The ship's timbers, each one a massive beam of seasoned wood, began to protest. The sounds were unlike anything the men had ever heard. Some would later describe them as being like heavy fireworks, a series of sharp, explosive cracks. Others said it sounded like the blasting of guns, a relentless artillery barrage from an invisible enemy. The ice was tearing their world apart. The ship's masts, which had stood so tall against the Antarctic sky, began to list at a sickening, unnatural angle. The deck, once a flat and steady surface, buckled and warped. The immense pressure was bending the very spine of the ship, twisting its hull as if it were a toy. Shackleton, a man of unshakable calm, walked the decks, observing the destruction. He knew the fight was over. The Endurance was lost. With a heavy heart, he gave the order that every man had been dreading. It was time to abandon ship. As the hull was finally breached, the sea began to claim its prize. Icy water poured into the ship, a fatal wound that could not be stopped. The men scrambled to save what they could. Food, fuel, sledges, and their 3 small lifeboats were lowered onto the ice. They worked with a grim, determined efficiency, their breath crystallizing in the frigid air. They established a new home on a thick, stable ice floe nearby. They called it Ocean Camp. It was a city of tents, a fragile refuge in a world of profound hostility. From there, they watched their old home die. In these final, chaotic hours, one man performed an act of incredible bravery. The expedition's photographer, an Australian named Frank Hurley, knew that his work was inside the dying ship. His glass plate negatives, the only visual record of their journey so far, were in his cabin. That cabin was now submerged in a slush of freezing seawater and floating debris. Without hesitation, Hurley stripped to his waist and plunged into the darkness. He dove into the freezing, waterlogged cabins, feeling his way through the submerged wreckage. He could only remain in the water for moments at a time, but he returned again and again. He saved what he could, emerging with his precious cargo of glass plates. He had managed to rescue around 120 of the most vital images, a testament to their journey, a record of their struggle. But Shackleton knew the psychological weight of their situation. He gathered Hurley and the rescued plates. He held each plate up to the light, and together they chose the very best ones, the ones that told their story most completely. Then Shackleton gave a heartbreaking order. The rest had to be destroyed. He smashed them himself, one by one. There could be no temptation, he explained, to ever consider returning to the wreck. Their path was forward now, only forward. The end came on the 21st of November. The ship, which had fought for so long, finally gave up. The men gathered on the ice and watched in a profound, echoing silence. The stern of the Endurance rose high into the air, as if in a final salute. Then, with a quiet sigh, she slipped beneath the surface. The ice closed over her, leaving nothing behind but a few floating pieces of wreckage. Their connection to home, to safety, to the entire world they had known, was gone. It had simply vanished. In that moment of utter desolation, with his men watching him, their faces etched with uncertainty, Shackleton spoke. His words were simple and direct. He said, "Ship and stores are gone, so now we'll go home, with their link to the world now gone." The men's focus immediately shifted from the lost ship to the vast, empty expanse of ice that stretched out before them. Their only hope lay to the west, and their only means of transport were the 3 small boats they had managed to salvage. The establishment of Ocean Camp was a deliberate act of defiance against despair. Shackleton understood that idleness was a poison more dangerous than the cold. He knew that for his men to survive, they needed purpose, they needed routine. And so, a new kind of life began on that drifting sheet of ice. The camp, their home for over a month, became a small, functioning society. Daily life was structured with almost military precision. There was no room for deviation. Meals were served at fixed times, a simple ritual that provided a comforting rhythm to their days. Every man was assigned specific duties, from hunting and cooking to maintaining the tents and equipment. This division of labor was not just practical, it was psychological. It ensured that every single man felt necessary, a vital part of the collective effort to survive. There were no passengers on the ice floe. Their diet was a testament to their resourcefulness. The Weddell Sea, though hostile, was rich with life. The men became expert hunters of seals and penguins. These animals provided almost everything they needed. The meat was their primary source of food, a rich, dark protein that kept their strength up, and the blubber, the thick layer of fat beneath the skin, was their fuel. The greasy, smoky smell of burning seal blubber in the cooking stove became the defining scent of their new home. It was the smell of warmth and the smell of a hot meal. It was the smell of survival. They lived and slept in simple canvas tents, thin layers of fabric that offered little protection against the staggering cold. At night, temperatures often dropped well below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. That is colder than -29 degrees Celsius. It was a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep through every layer of wool and fur, a cold that made every breath a painful, sharp intake of frigid air. Sleep was often a fleeting comfort, punctuated by the shivers that racked their bodies. The sled dogs, which they had brought with them for the planned crossing of the continent, were a cherished part of life at the camp. They were companions, their playful antics a source of constant amusement and a welcome distraction from the grim reality of their situation. The men loved the dogs, but their presence was also a source of quiet concern. They represented another set of mouths to feed, a constant drain on their precious and finite resources. Every day, the expedition's navigator, a brilliant New Zealander named Frank Worsley, would perform a crucial ritual. Using his sextant and chronometer, he would take readings of the sun's position. He was charting their drift, trying to understand where the ice was taking them. His daily findings were a source of both hope and anxiety. The news was rarely good. The complex currents of the Weddell Sea were not carrying them towards land. Instead, their floating home was moving further and further away from any potential rescue. The sun, during the long Antarctic summer, never truly set. It simply circled low on the horizon, a constant, pale light that blurred the passage of time. Days could feel endless. To combat the crushing monotony, the men found ways to entertain themselves. They held sing-alongs, their voices carrying out over the silent white landscape. They played frantic games of football on the ice, slipping and sliding in their heavy boots. They even celebrated birthdays, marking the occasion with an extra portion of food and a round of cheerful songs. These moments of normalcy were a lifeline, a way of holding on to their humanity. But beneath the routine and the camaraderie, there was a constant, underlying threat. Their entire world rested on a single sheet of ice, and that ice was not entirely stable. It was a living, moving thing. The constant, soft crunch of their boots on the snow was the dominant sound of their world, but it was often punctuated by a much more menacing noise, a deep groan or a sharp crack. Fissures could appear without warning, splitting their flow apart. A crack could open directly beneath a tent while the men slept inside, forcing a sudden, panicked move in the middle of the night. They lived with the knowledge that their solid ground could vanish from under them at any moment. By the 21st of December, after weeks of Worsley's disheartening reports, Shackleton made a decision. The drift was too slow, too unreliable. They were losing ground. Passively waiting for the ice to deliver them was no longer an option. It was a potential death sentence. They had to take action. They had to begin marching across the ice, dragging their lifeboats and supplies with them toward the distant promise of open water. The routine of ocean camp was about to be shattered by a period of brutal, back-breaking labor. They would attempt to conquer the ice by force. This attempt to march proved to be an exercise in futility. The men packed their sledges, harnessed themselves to the heavy lifeboats, and began to pull. But the terrain was a nightmare. They soon gave up, exhausted. They established a new camp, a place they wryly named Patience Camp. Here they would stay for over 3 months, a long and trying period of waiting. While the routine they had established at Ocean Camp provided a fragile sense of normalcy, the slow, aimless drift of their ice floe was, in reality, a form of prison. Shackleton knew that passive waiting was a slow surrender to fate. The time had come once again to take action, to begin the truly arduous march toward the sea. The plan was simple in its conception, but monumental in its execution. They would drag their 3 salvaged lifeboats across the treacherous, broken terrain of the pack ice. These boats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, were their only hope of salvation. But they were heavy, clinker-built whaling boats, each one weighing over a ton. Moving them across solid ground would have been difficult. Moving them across a chaotic, shifting landscape of ice was a task of almost unimaginable scale. The surface of the pack ice was not the flat, smooth plain one might imagine. It was a maze, a chaotic jumble of pressure ridges. These were walls of ice, forced upwards by the immense forces of the colliding floes. Some of these ridges were as tall as houses, jagged and impassable. The men had to create their own path. They went ahead of the boats with axes and heavy ice picks, hacking away at the frozen terrain, creating a crude road through the wilderness of ice. It was grueling, exhausting work. Teams of men harnessed themselves to the heavy sledges that carried the boats. They leaned into the leather straps, their muscles straining, their bodies bent low against the weight. They were like animals, beasts of burden, pulling their own arcs through the frozen wasteland. The rhythmic sound of their effort filled the air. There was the constant, uniform crunch of dozens of boots digging into the snow, a sound accompanied by the low groans of men straining against their harnesses. The sight of their own breath, a physical cloud of white, crystallized instantly in the frigid air as they gasped for oxygen. The burning sensation in their lungs from breathing the super-chilled air during this intense physical exertion was a constant torment. Progress was agonizingly slow. It was a brutal, soul-crushing calculus of effort versus distance. On their worst day, after hours of non-stop back-breaking labor, they had moved the boats less than a single mile. The summer sun, which should have brought relief, instead made their task even harder. The surface snow became soft and slushy, a sticky morass that grabbed at the sledge runners. With every step, the heavy sledges would sink deep into the snow, and the men would have to heave with all their might to break them free. Each jolt, each sharp, jarring shock, felt as a sledge runner hit a solid block of ice, traveled up through their arms and into their very bones. During this torturous march, Shackleton was forced to make one of the most difficult decisions of the expedition. The sled dogs, their loyal companions, were struggling. The weakest among them could no longer keep up, and they were consuming precious food that the men themselves would soon need. With a heavy heart, Shackleton gave the order. The weakest dogs had to be shot. For the men who had cared for these animals and shared the journey with them, it was a moment of profound sadness. It was a stark reminder of how thin their margin of survival had truly become. The Great Ice March lasted for only 7 days. 7 days of Herculean effort that gained them almost nothing. The sheer impossibility of the task became clear to everyone. They were expending enormous amounts of energy for almost no reward. Shackleton, ever the pragmatist, called a halt. They would stop and wait. They established their new home, Patience Camp, and settled in for a long stay. This brief, exhausting effort was not a failure, however. It was a lesson. It proved to the men that their salvation would not be won by brute force alone. They were at the mercy of the ice, and they would have to trust its slow, northward drift. More than that, the shared struggle of the march forged them into a more cohesive unit. The experience of straining together on the ropes, of pushing the smooth, worn texture of the wooden gunwales of the boats with their frostbitten hands, had bound them closer than ever before. It created a deep, unspoken sense of teamwork, a shared understanding that they would only survive this ordeal if they did so together. The march had proved that brute force alone was not the answer. They had to wait for nature to lend them a hand. As the months passed at Patience Camp, the slow drift of the ice carried them steadily north, and the soundscape of their world began to change. The deep groaning of solid ice was slowly being replaced by a new sound, the distant, promising sound of waves. For months, the men had lived on a solid, if unstable, platform of ice. It was their island, their continent, their entire world. But that world was coming to an end. On the 8th of April, 1916, the long-dreaded moment finally arrived. A huge swell, born from a distant storm, rolled through the pack ice. Their floe, which had been their home for so long, began to break apart. The split came suddenly, a violent tearing of their reality. One fissure opened directly beneath the tent, plunging it and its sleeping occupant into the churning, icy sea. The man was rescued, but the message was clear. Their time on the ice was over. The breakup of the floe forced them into immediate, frantic action. There was no time for careful planning. They had to launch the lifeboats with the utmost urgency before the very ground beneath them disappeared completely. The 3 small boats were loaded with men, equipment, and their dwindling supplies. They were dangerously overloaded, sitting low in the water. The transition was terrifying. They were leaving the solid, predictable world of the floe for the chaos of the open sea. Their initial destination was a place called Paulet Island. It was a remote and uninhabited speck of land, but they knew from their charts that a supply depot had been left there by a previous expedition. It was a tangible goal, a point of hope on the map. But the sea that lay between them and that hope was not open water. It was a treacherous slurry of what sailors call brash ice, a thick, grinding soup of smaller ice chunks, interspersed with much larger, menacing icebergs. Navigating this moving maze was incredibly dangerous. The grinding, scraping noise as the boat's hull bumped and slid against the floating chunks of ice was a constant, unnerving soundtrack to their journey. The dangers were not just from the ice. The waters were alive. Killer whales, orcas, frequently surfaced near their small boats. The men would see the massive, dark shapes moving just beneath the surface, their tall dorsal fins slicing through the water. They were a terrifying, silent presence, a reminder of the powerful predators who called this lethal environment home. The men felt an utter and profound sense of vulnerability, sitting in their tiny wooden boats, surrounded by towering, cathedral-sized icebergs and the unseen giants of the deep. The human cost of this new phase of their journey was immediate and severe. After months on solid ice, the constant, violent motion of the sea made most of the men desperately seasick. Their bodies were racked with frostbite from the constant exposure to the wind and freezing spray. The taste of that salty spray was a constant companion, so cold that it felt like a physical blow to the face every time a wave broke over the bow. Painful saltwater boils erupted on their skin, caused by their soaked clothing rubbing against them day after day. The 3 boats, each commanded by an officer, struggled to stay together. In the rough seas and poor visibility of the Antarctic twilight, it was easy to lose sight of one another. They were 3 tiny specks of life in an immense, gray, and hostile ocean. After days of rowing and sailing through this icy chaos, a new, crushing reality dawned on them. Worsley, the navigator, confirmed their fears. The currents were too strong. They were being pushed away from their goal. Paulet Island was unreachable. Shackleton had to make a new plan. Looking at their charts, he chose a new destination. It was another remote outpost, a place called Elephant Island. It was a name on a page, a shape on a map, but it was a place that was completely unknown to them. No one had ever landed there. They had no idea what they would find. But it was land, and it was in a direction the currents might just allow them to reach. He set the new course after months stranded on the solid prison of the ice. They were finally moving under their own power, but they had simply traded one prison for another. The chaotic, unpredictable sea was now their world, and the challenge was no longer about moving tons of wood and supplies, but about keeping their 3 small, fragile shelters afloat on the waves. They had escaped the ice, but now they faced the immense and unforgiving Southern Ocean. Can you imagine the feeling of leaving the solid ground of the floe, even as it was breaking up under your feet, for the terrifying uncertainty of those waves? It is a profound shift in reality, a leap from one kind of danger into another, entirely different one. Let us follow them now into that cold, gray water. The journey began on the 9th of April, 1916. It would last for 7 nights and for 7 agonizing days. 28 men, packed into 3 small, open lifeboats, now faced the full fury of the Southern Ocean. They had left the relative stability of the ice and had entered a world of constant motion, of relentless cold, and of profound, soul-crushing doubt. This was a voyage for which they were not equipped, in boats that were never meant to be there. Life in the boats quickly settled into a grim rhythm of suffering. The greatest enemy was the water itself. It was everywhere. Huge, gray waves, born from the immense storms of the Drake Passage, would rise up like moving mountains before crashing down over the sides of the small boats. The water was just above freezing, and every wave that broke over them was a physical shock, a thief that stole precious warmth from their bodies. Their primary task, a task that never ended, was bailing. Men scooped and threw water back into the sea with any container they could find, a desperate, losing battle against the ocean's relentless invasion. Sleep was a fantasy. There was no dry place to rest, no quiet moment to be found. The men's sleeping bags, which had been a source of comfort on the ice, were now instruments of torture. They were made from reindeer hide, a material that was warm when dry, but became a nightmare when wet. Soaked with freezing salt water, the bags froze solid. They were as hard and as unyielding as sheets of ice, completely impossible to use. The men could only doze in snatches, sitting upright, their bodies slumped against one another for a sliver of shared warmth. There was an overwhelming, crushing fatigue that settled deep into their bones. It was a weariness mixed with the frustrating inability to find a single moment of true rest. Their clothes were permanently soaked, and the relentless wind froze them stiff. The fabric was like a suit of icy armor against their skin, chafing and painful. Their beards and eyebrows became caked in a thick, white layer of frozen sea spray, giving each man the appearance of a frostbitten old mariner. Thirst became a torment far worse than hunger. They were surrounded by an infinite amount of water, but it was all salt water, impossible to drink. Their supply of fresh water was frighteningly limited, stored in small casks, and it had to be rationed with painful strictness. Each man received only a few sips a day, barely enough to wet their cracked lips. The craving for water was a constant, maddening presence, and soon, some of the men, their minds clouded by exhaustion, began to show signs of delirium. Frostbite was a constant, insidious danger. The men's hands, from constantly gripping wet ropes and oars, were raw and chafed. Their fingers turned black from the cold. Their noses and their feet, which were permanently submerged in the icy bilge water at the bottom of the boats, suffered the same fate. Every man on that journey would carry the physical scars of the cold for the rest of his life. Hot food, a simple comfort that could have raised their spirits, was an almost unattainable luxury. They had a small stove, a clever invention that ran on blubber, but it was nearly impossible to use in the heaving seas. Lighting it was a struggle, and keeping it lit while the boat pitched and rolled was a constant challenge. On the rare occasions they succeeded, they would huddle around its meager flame, melting ice for a precious mouthful of warm liquid. A brief and welcome respite from the endless cold. The three boats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, were their own tiny fleet, a fragile community in the vast wilderness of the ocean. But the high seas and thick fog often separated them. Hours would pass where one boat was completely alone, a single speck of humanity with no sign of its companions. The monotonous, rhythmic squeak of the oars in their locks was the only sound, a noise that went on for hours and for days, a soundtrack to their misery. In these moments of isolation, the fear that they were truly alone, that the other boats had been lost, was a heavy weight on their hearts. Throughout this ordeal, Ernest Shackleton, in the lead boat, the James Caird, was a pillar of strength. He took on the role of the fleet's guardian. For days on end, he seemed to forego sleep entirely. He would stand at the tiller, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the other boats, his voice calm and reassuring as he shouted encouragement across the waves. He nursed the sick, he rationed the water, and he kept hope alive when it seemed most lost. And in a moment of desperate ingenuity, the men remembered that the expedition's painter, George Marston, had packed his oil paints. This artistic luxury became a tool for survival, as the thick paint was used to help caulk the seams of the boats, sealing them against the relentless sea. In this chaos of cold and thirst and exhaustion, with no landmarks to guide them, and a sky that was almost permanently obscured by a thick blanket of gray clouds, the survival of all 28 men depended entirely on the calculations, the skill, and the instincts of one man. A man who had to find a tiny, unknown island in the middle of a vast and stormy ocean. That man was Frank Worsley, a New Zealander, and the captain of the lost ship Endurance. He was a highly experienced navigator, a member of the Royal Naval Reserve, and he was, without question, the right man for this impossible task. His mind was a complex map of stars and currents, but his primary tools were beautifully simple. He had a sextant, an instrument used for measuring the angle of the sun above the horizon, and he had a chronometer, which was essentially a very accurate clock that told him the precise time at Greenwich, in England. With these two pieces of information, the sun's angle and the exact time, he could calculate their position on the Earth. But the theory was far simpler than the practice. To get what sailors call a sun sight, he needed two things that were almost never available on their journey. He needed a clear, visible horizon, and he needed to be able to see the sun. For days at a time, the sky was a uniform, featureless gray, and the horizon was lost in a blur of fog and ocean spray. Worsley would watch the sky with a hawk's intensity, waiting for even the briefest break in the clouds. When a fleeting opportunity came, the process was a feat of incredible teamwork and personal endurance. The boat was constantly bucking and rolling in the violent waves. It was impossible to stand steady. Worsley would have to be held upright by two other men, their bodies bracing him against the mast as he tried to bring his instrument to his eye. He would squint at the fleeting patch of brightness in the clouds, trying to line up that sliver of sun, the razor-thin line of the distant horizon, and the precise markings on his sextant. It was an abstract, almost impossible visual puzzle. His hands, like everyone else's, were often numb with cold. The sextant, a beautiful object of brass and glass, felt like a piece of ice against his frozen fingers. He struggled to make the delicate adjustments required, his numb digits fumbling with the small screws, and yet, time and again, he would succeed. When he finally got a reading, the feeling of hope that would surge through the small boat was a palpable thing. It was a victory against the storm, a small piece of certainty in a world of chaos. His work did not end there. After taking a sight, he had to do the calculations. He would retreat to the tiny makeshift shelter at the stern of the boat, his navigation books and scraps of paper often soaked with seawater. The delicate, scratching sound of his pencil on the wet paper was the sound of their survival being written, one equation at a time. For most of the journey, however, the sun remained hidden. During these long periods, Worsley had to rely on a much more uncertain method of navigation. It was called dead reckoning. This was the art of calculating their position based on their last known location, their estimated speed, their direction, and the powerful effects of the ocean currents and the wind. It was more of an educated guess than a science. This was made incredibly difficult because the currents of the Weddell Sea were poorly charted. No one knew for sure which way the water was pushing them. Every calculation was a gamble. Yet, despite all these obstacles, Worsley's accuracy was nothing short of miraculous. His ability to find Elephant Island, a tiny, insignificant speck on the map in the middle of the world's most violent ocean, is still considered one of the greatest feats of navigation in all of human history. Shackleton's faith in his navigator was absolute. He trusted Worsley completely, and that trust radiated outwards, providing a vital anchor for the morale of the other men. Worsley's quiet confidence, his unwavering focus amidst the suffering, gave them a direction. It gave them a reason to keep rowing. His calculations gave them a hope, but the sea still had its own plans. And after days of relentless effort, the men were at the absolute limit of their human endurance. They needed to find land, and they needed to find it soon. After 7 days at sea, on the 14th of April, it happened. A cry went out from one of the boats. Land. The word itself was a miracle. It was first sighted by Perce Blackborough, the young stowaway who had hidden himself on the Endurance so many months ago. Through a break in the mist, he had seen it, a dark, jagged shape against the gray sky. The sight of it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated joy through the exhausted men. Some wept openly. Others were too weak to do anything but stare. Their initial landing spot was a narrow, rocky beach, nestled at the base of immense, towering black cliffs. They named it Cape Valentine. Getting to the shore was the final, desperate struggle. Some men were so weak from dehydration and exposure that they simply collapsed at their oars. They had to be lifted from the boats and carried ashore by their slightly stronger companions. And then they were there. For the first time in 497 days, they stood on solid, unmoving ground. The feeling was almost disorienting. After 16 months on the constantly shifting platform of the ice floe, and a week in a rolling pitching boat, the stillness of the land felt unnatural. Many of the men reported that the solid ground felt like it was swaying beneath their feet, their bodies still attuned to the endless motion of the sea. One of their first acts on shore was to seek out fresh water. They found streams of it, pouring down from the glaciers that covered the island. It was pure, clean, glacial melt. For the first time in over a year, they could drink their fill. Two men who had been suffering the agony of extreme thirst for days. This simple act was a luxury beyond description. The taste of that cold, fresh water was the taste of life itself. A new world of senses opened up to them. The deafening sound of the waves crashing onto the rocky shore was a constant, powerful roar that would come to dominate their new lives. The sight of the towering black cliffs and the immense laking glaciers was a landscape that was both magnificent and utterly terrifying. And there were new smells. The pungent, ammonia-like scent of penguin guano and the clean, wet smell of rock. These were the first smells other than salt and smoke and their own unwashed bodies that they had experienced in many, many months. But their initial euphoria was short-lived. A grim reality began to set in. They soon discovered that their landing site, their first piece of solid ground, was directly below the high tide mark. When the tide came in, the entire beach would be submerged by the waves. It was not a safe haven. They had to move. Exhausted as they were, they climbed back into their boats and made another short, perilous journey along the coast, searching for a more permanent home. The place they found was a narrow spit of rock-strewn land, measuring just 200 yards long. It was bleak and windswept and utterly desolate. They named it Point Wild, after Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command. This would be their new home. But Elephant Island was a deeply inhospitable place. There was no vegetation, not a single tree or bush. The land was either sheer, glaciated cliff or jagged rock, and it was constantly battered by ferocious Antarctic winds. It offered them shelter from the immediate danger of the sea, but it was a trap. They were hundreds of miles from any known shipping lanes. No whaling ships or any other vessels ever passed this way. No one in the outside world even knew they were alive, let alone where to look for them. They were safe from the ocean for now, but they were stranded on a desolate rock with winter approaching. Their survival now depended on one last desperate gamble. A small party would have to leave this place and continue the journey. Shackleton knew that staying on Elephant Island was a slow death sentence. Their supplies were dwindling, and the Antarctic winter was closing in. Rescue would not come to them. They had to go out and get it. He made the fateful decision. He would take the strongest of the 3 lifeboats, the James Caird. an attempt to sail 800 nautical miles across the most dangerous stretch of ocean on the planet. Their destination was the island of South Georgia, where they knew there were several active whaling stations. It was an almost suicidal mission, a desperate roll of the dice. He chose 5 men to accompany him. The selection was critical. He needed the best of the best. Frank Worsley, the brilliant navigator, was the first and most obvious choice. Their lives would depend on his skill. He also chose Tom Crean, an Irish sailor who was known for his incredible toughness and unwavering optimism. Also chosen were John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy, 2 strong, reliable seamen. And finally, he chose the expedition's carpenter, a Scotsman named Harry "Chippy" McNeish. McNeish was perhaps the most crucial member of the boat party. It was his job to transform the 22-foot lifeboat into a vessel that could withstand the fury of the Southern Ocean. The sound of McNeish's hammer and saw soon filled the air at Point Wild. It was a purposeful, hopeful noise, a sound of creation set against the constant, mournful backdrop of the crashing waves. Using wood salvaged from packing cases and the runners from the now useless sledges, he built a makeshift deck over the open boat. It was a low canvas and wood cuddy, not much, but it would provide a small amount of shelter from the elements. The seams of the boat, which had been leaking during their journey from the ice, had to be made completely watertight. McNeish improvised. He used lampwick and Marston's oil paints, mixing them with seal blood to create a thick, sticky paste. He and the other men forced this gruesome but effective mixture into every single crack and seam of the boat's hull. The smell of sawdust and fresh-cut wood, a scent of civilization, was a stark contrast to the ever-present smells of salt and wet rock. To make the small boat more stable in the gigantic waves they would face, it needed more weight. Low down in its hull, it needed ballast. The crew spent hours dragging heavy bags of rocks and shingle down the beach, a heavy, grinding sound that echoed their own exhaustion. They loaded them into the bottom of the James Caird, along with supplies for 6 men, calculated to last for 1 month. Shackleton reasoned that if they could not reach South Georgia in that time, they would be lost to the sea anyway. The selection of McNeish for this vital journey was a complex and masterful piece of leadership by Shackleton. On the ice, after the Endurance had sunk, McNeish had briefly challenged Shackleton's authority. He had argued, correctly from a legal standpoint, that with the ship gone, the men were no longer under contract. It was a moment of potential mutiny, which Shackleton had quickly and firmly put down. By choosing McNeish for the boat journey, Shackleton was not only utilizing his essential skills, he was also bringing a potential troublemaker with him, under his direct command, while leaving the harmonious group behind. The 22 men who would remain on Elephant Island were left under the command of Frank Wild. He was Shackleton's loyal and dependable second-in-command. Shackleton's final orders to Wild were simple and chilling. "If I don't come back by the spring," he said, "you are to try and get out." With the James Caird as ready as it could ever be, and the hopes of 22 stranded men resting on their shoulders, Shackleton and his small crew prepared to launch into the world's most dangerous ocean. Imagine that moment on the beach. You are watching 5 of your companions, 5 of your brothers, in survival, get into a tiny, patched-up boat. You watch them prepare to sail into a storm-filled ocean, knowing that your own life depends entirely on their success. It is an almost unbearable weight of hope and of fear. Let us join them now as they push off from the shore. The tiny boat, the James Caird, was pushed out into the surf on the 24th of April, 1916. As the 6 men climbed aboard, the 22 they left behind gave them 3 faint, hopeful cheers. Those cheers were soon swallowed by the immense, gray silence of the Southern Ocean. The boat, a mere 22 feet long, their journey had begun. For 17 days, the James Caird was a world of its own, a small floating pocket of human endurance in a universe of elemental fury. The ocean they sailed was not calm. It rose up against them in towering waves, some reaching heights of over 60 feet. Shackleton, a veteran of the seas, would later write that they were the largest waves he had ever seen in his life. The boat's motion was a violent, unpredictable torment. It was thrown upwards on the face of a wave, hanging for a terrifying moment at its peak, before plunging down into the deep trough on the other side. The wind was a constant, deafening roar. It was a sensory assault that never ceased, a sound that drilled into the men's minds, making conversation difficult and thought almost impossible. And with the wind came the water. It was everywhere. Icy waves crashed continuously over the makeshift deck, finding their way through every tiny gap in the canvas. The men were completely, permanently saturated. They could feel the icy water trickling down their backs, pooling in their boots, a constant, chilling presence that stole their body heat and their will. There was another, more insidious threat. The freezing spray began to build up on the deck, the mast, and the rigging. It formed a heavy, thick coating of ice, a growing weight that threatened to make the small boat top-heavy, to make it roll over and sink without a trace. The men had to fight it. They would take turns, crawling out from their shelter onto the slick, heaving deck. With axes and knives, they would chip and hack at the ice, their hands numb, their bodies lashed by the wind, sending the frozen sheets sliding into the sea. It was a perilous, exhausting task, but a necessary one. Life aboard was divided into a simple, brutal routine. The 6 men were split into 2 watches of 3. One watch would sail the boat, manning the tiller and the sails, while the other 3 men would try to rest in the cramped, dark space below the deck. But rest was nearly impossible. The space was tiny, smelling of damp wool, foul bilge water, and the greasy scent of cooking seal meat. They offered no warmth, only a damp, unpleasant chill. A leak developed somewhere in the hull, and soon a steady stream of icy water was trickling into their living space. This required constant pumping with a small, inefficient hand pump. It was another task in a long list of tasks that kept them from collapsing into despair. Amidst this misery, the cook performed daily miracles. Using their small Primus stove, which he had to brace between his legs to keep steady, he managed to prepare hot meals. A warm stew of seal meat, a hot drink made from powdered milk. These small comforts were a critical boost to morale, a warm anchor in a world of freezing chaos. One day, Shackleton was at the tiller when he saw something that made his blood run cold. He thought he saw a break in the dark storm clouds, but then he realized his mistake. It was not a break in the clouds. It was the white crest of a wave, a wall of water of immense size, a true rogue wave bearing down on them. He shouted a warning, and the men braced themselves for the impact. The boat was lifted up and thrown forward, surfing on what Shackleton called a mighty upheaval of the ocean. They were tossed about like a piece of cork, but somehow the little boat survived. It had been their closest brush with death yet. Throughout this entire 17-day journey, the sky remained a near constant blanket of gray. For Worsley, the navigator, it was a professional nightmare. He was only able to get 4 proper navigational sights during the entire voyage. For the rest of the time, he guided them by dead reckoning, by his expert intuition of the wind and the currents. Then, on the 8th of May, the clouds finally parted for a moment, and through that brief window they saw it, the dark, jagged peaks of South Georgia land. It was a miracle. But their ordeal was not over. The same storm that had tormented them at sea was now threatening to dash their little boat to pieces against the cliffs of the island's uninhabited southern coast. The wind shrieked, and the sea became a churning chaos of white water. The sight of land, which should have been a cause for celebration, was now a source of terror. The massive, dark cliffs of the island would appear and disappear in the thick sea mist, a promise of solid ground that was also a deadly threat. The hurricane-force winds made a landing impossible. They were in danger of being driven directly onto the rocky lie shore, where the James Caird would be smashed to pieces in moments. Worsley, with his incredible seamanship, knew what they had to do. They had to drop their sea anchor, a makeshift device designed to keep the boat's bow pointed into the wind, and simply try to ride out the storm. For 9 agonizing hours, they were at the mercy of the hurricane. The boat was pushed backwards, away from the land they had fought so hard to reach, back out into the open, raging sea. When the storm finally passed, the men were left in a state of profound exhaustion. It was a deep weariness that went far beyond simple muscle fatigue, a depletion that seemed to settle in their very bones. And they had another critical problem. Their small cask of fresh water was empty. They were dying of thirst. Just as despair began to set in, they came across a small, floating iceberg. They managed to moor alongside it and hack off chunks of the freshwater ice, a gift from the sea. The profound relief of drinking that pure, uncontaminated water for the first time in over 2 weeks was an indescribable pleasure. Now, with the sea calmer, they could attempt a landing. They scouted the coast and eventually found a small, sheltered cove. They named it King Haakon Bay. But even this final approach was perilous. As they navigated the treacherous entrance, a wave caught the boat and threw Timothy McCarthy into the freezing surf. He was quickly pulled back aboard, but it was a final reminder of the ocean's power. Battered and bruised, the James Caird finally grated against the rocky shore. They had made it. They were on solid land. They found a small cave nearby, which offered shelter from the wind. The earthy, damp smell of the cave was a welcome change from the constant stench of salt water and rot. They were able to hunt the huge albatrosses that nested on the cliffs and the seals that crowded the beaches. For the first time in months, they had a reliable source of fresh food. They rested, they ate, and they began to recover their strength. But a new, daunting reality soon became clear. 3 of the men were too weak to continue the journey. McNeish, the carpenter, and John Vincent, the sailor, were at their absolute physical and mental limits. The journey had broken them, and McCarthy was needed to stay behind to tend to them. The whaling stations, their ultimate goal, were on the other side of the island. As the crow flies, they were only 22 miles away, but between them and salvation lay a spine of unmapped, glaciated mountains, a fortress of rock and ice that no human had ever crossed. The boat was too battered from the landing, and the prevailing westerly winds would make such a journey a suicidal effort. There was only one choice left, a choice of staggering audacity. Shackleton made the decision. He, along with Worsley and Tom Crean, would attempt the first ever crossing of South Georgia's mountainous interior. They had crossed the ocean, but the final, and perhaps greatest, barrier was now revealed. With no climbing gear, and only the most basic equipment, 3 men prepared for one last, impossible journey. The crossing began on the 19th of May. The 3 men, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean, traveled light. They carried with them only a 50-foot length of rope, a carpenter's adze to be used as a makeshift ice axe, and a small amount of food. They had no tents, no sleeping bags, and their clothes were the same tattered, worn-out rags they had been wearing for months. Their only map was a rough sketch of the island's coastline. The interior was a complete mystery. Their first challenge was the ice. To get any grip on the slick, frozen surfaces of the glaciers, they needed something to bite into the ice. With quiet ingenuity, they took the brass screws from the hull of the James Caird and pushed them through the thin soles of their boots. These screws, protruding just a little bit, would act as makeshift crampons. The crunch and squeak of these homemade spikes biting into the hard glacier ice was a hopeful sound, the sound of progress. They climbed for hours, moving upwards into a world of profound and disorienting silence. The only sounds were the wind whistling over the high peaks and their own labored, ragged breathing. They had to navigate treacherous, hidden crevasses, deep cracks in the glaciers that could swallow a man whole. Often, a thick fog would descend, reducing visibility to just a few feet, forcing them to rely on Worsley's uncanny sense of direction. They climbed through the Allardyce Range, a collection of peaks that rise to over 9,000 feet. As they gained altitude, they rose above the fog. They found themselves standing on a mountain peak, looking out over a vast, silent sea of clouds that stretched to the horizon, a sight of breathtaking, unearthly beauty. But they could not rest. They had to keep moving. At one point, as dusk began to fall, they found themselves trapped on a high peak. To descend the way they had come would take too long, and to be caught on the mountain in the darkness meant certain death from exposure. They had to get down to a lower altitude, and fast. Shackleton made a bold, almost reckless decision. They coiled their rope into a loop, sat upon it as if it were a toboggan, and launched themselves down a steep 1,000-foot snow slope into the darkness below. The feeling of adrenaline and pure fear as they slid uncontrollably down the dark mountain slope was overwhelming. They shot downwards at an incredible speed, arriving at the bottom, shaken but alive, in just a few minutes. The gamble had paid off. For 36 hours, they marched without sleep. They pushed their bodies and their minds to the very edge of human limits, and perhaps beyond. In the years that followed, all 3 men would independently report a strange and profound experience they had on that crossing. Each of them felt, with absolute certainty, that there was a 4th person traveling with them. It was not a frightening presence, but a benign, helpful one, a quiet companion guiding them through the wasteland. This is a known psychological phenomenon, often reported by explorers pushed to the brink of exhaustion, a strange and wondrous trick of the mind. As the dawn of the second day broke, they paused, weary to their very souls, and in the silence of the high mountains, they heard something. It was a faint, distant sound, a sound so alien to their world that at first they could not place it. It was the sound of a steam whistle cutting through the fog. It was the 7 a.m. work whistle from the Stromness whaling station. It was the first sound of the outside world that any of them had heard in nearly 2 years. That distant sound, a whisper of industry and of humanity, was the signal that their long ordeal was nearly over. All that remained was to descend from the frozen, silent world of the peaks into the world of men. Their final descent was a treacherous one. To reach the valley floor that led to the whaling station, they had to climb down a frozen waterfall, a sheer wall of ice. It was their last great physical test. Once down, they saw signs of civilization, but the men themselves were no longer civilized in their appearance. Their hair and beards were long and matted. Their faces were blackened by months of cooking with blubber smoke. Their clothes were in tatters, and their eyes were wild. The first people they encountered were two young boys playing near the station. When the boys saw these three strange, ragged figures approaching, they took one look and ran away in fright. The three explorers continued on, walking into the heart of the Stromness whaling station. The place was an assault on the senses. There was the overwhelming smell of boiling whale oil and coal smoke. There was the constant, deafening sound of Norwegian voices and the loud clatter of industrial machinery. It was the sound of a world they thought they might never hear again. They made their way to the station manager's house. Worsley had met the manager, a man named Thoralf Sorrel, on a previous visit to the island years before. When Sorrel opened the door, he saw three wild men standing before him. He did not recognize them. Shackleton spoke. He explained who they were. When the station manager finally realized who was standing in front of him, that this was the great explorer, Sir Ernest Shackleton, who had been presumed dead for well over a year, it is said that he turned away and wept. The men were brought inside. Their first request was a simple one. They wanted a hot bath. The feeling of that hot, clean water on their skin, washing away months of grime and salt and sweat, was a sensation of almost spiritual bliss. They saw their own reflections in a mirror for the first time in months. They were shocked by the sight of their own weathered, gaunt faces. They were given fresh clothes and a proper meal, the taste of fresh bread and hot coffee. Simple flavors they had dreamed about for so long seemed impossibly, wonderfully luxurious. The Norwegian whalers at the station treated them with a kind of reverence and awe. They could not believe that these men had not only sailed an open boat from the Antarctic, but had then crossed the island's impossible mountains. But even in this moment of personal triumph and comfort, Shackleton's mind was on the men he had left behind. His first and most pressing concern was organizing the rescue. Within hours of his arrival, a boat was dispatched with Worsley aboard to go around the island and pick up the three men left in King Haakon Bay. And immediately after that, Shackleton began the long and difficult process of planning the much larger rescue, the rescue of the 22 men still waiting on Elephant Island. The arrival at Stromness on the 20th of May, 1916, marked the end of their own 522-day ordeal. And so, the great journey was over. Three men, powered by sheer will, had crossed an impossible ocean and an uncharted mountain range, bringing with them the promise of rescue for all. As Shackleton, Crean, and Worsley soaked in the warmth of the station, their thoughts were already turning back to the south, to the 22 men huddled on a desolate shore, waiting for the ship that would, eventually, bring them all home. It is a powerful reminder that the end of one journey is often just the beginning of another. Thank you for joining me for the main part of their story. I hope you are feeling relaxed and comfortable. The rest of our tale will continue to gently unfold, so just continue to rest. For the three men who had reached the Stromness whaling station, their personal ordeal was over. But for Sir Ernest Shackleton, the journey was far from complete. He now carried the immense weight of the 22 men he had left behind, huddled on the desolate shores of Elephant Island. His focus, with a singular and unwavering intensity, shifted entirely to their rescue. It would prove to be a challenge almost as great as the one he had just overcome. His first attempt began almost immediately. He secured the use of a large British whaling ship, the Southern Sky, which was moored in South Georgia, but it was now deep into the southern winter. As they steamed south, they encountered the vast, impenetrable barrier of the winter pack ice. The ice, which had once been their prison, was now the guard of the prison they had escaped. The Southern Sky was a wooden vessel, and to push into the ice would have been suicide. 70 miles from the island, a heartbreakingly small distance, they were forced to turn back. Shackleton did not despair. He sailed to the Falkland Islands, and from there to Uruguay, seeking help. The government of Uruguay, moved by his story, generously loaned him a small, sturdy trawler, the Instituto de Pesca No. 1. Once again, Shackleton sailed south, his hopes renewed, but once again, the relentless ice of the Antarctic winter defeated him. The small trawler battled the growing ice fields for days, but it could not find a way through. A second time, he was forced to retreat. For his third attempt, he found help from the British community in Punta Arenas, Chile. They raised the funds to charter a small schooner named the Ima. She was a small, graceful ship, but she was not built for the Antarctic. As they sailed towards the ice, her auxiliary engine failed. Battered by storms and facing the ever-present wall of white, the third attempt also ended in failure. 3 times he had tried to reach his men, and 3 times he had been turned away. A lesser man might have given up, but Shackleton's resolve only hardened. For his fourth and final attempt, he turned to the Chilean government. They offered him the use of the Yelcho, a small, steel-hulled steam tug. She was part of the Chilean Navy, commanded by a brave and compassionate man named Captain Luis Pardo. The Yelcho was a humble vessel. She had no radio, so they would be completely cut off from the world once they left port. And she was not an icebreaker. Her steel hull was thin, not designed to withstand the crushing pressure of the pack. The journey would be incredibly risky, but Shackleton knew it was their last, best hope. Meanwhile, on Elephant Island, 22 men waited. Their leader was Frank Wild, a man of immense calm and fortitude. For 4.5 long months, he had held the men together. He maintained a strict routine, a sense of purpose that kept despair at bay. They lived under 2 of the overturned lifeboats, a cramped, dark shelter against the ferocious winds. They hunted for penguins and seals, and they watched the sea. Every single morning, Wild would issue the same order: lash up and stow. Every man had to pack his gear, ready to leave at a moment's notice. He was determined that rescue, when it came, would find them ready. On the 30th of August, 1916, the long wait came to an end. It was a day of mist and low cloud. Then, through a sudden break in the fog, one of the men saw it, a thin column of smoke on the horizon. At first, he thought he was imagining things, but he kept watching, and the smoke grew thicker. It was a ship. A wave of disbelief, followed by pure, overwhelming joy, swept through the small camp. They lit a signal fire, a desperate beacon of hope. On the deck of the Yelcho, Shackleton peered through his binoculars. He saw the smoke from their fire. He saw the tiny figures of his men emerging from their shelter. The calm, steady, chugging sound of the Yelcho's steam engine grew louder and louder as Captain Pardo skillfully navigated the ship closer to the dangerous shore. As they drew near enough to shout, Shackleton, his heart in his throat, yelled out across the water, "Are you all well?" From the shore, a figure he recognized as Frank Wild cupped his hands to his mouth and yelled back, his voice thick with emotion, "All well, all safe, all well." The rescue was swift. Within an hour, all 22 men were aboard the Yelcho. They were thin and ragged and grimy, but they were alive, every single one of them. The feeling of a solid steel deck under their feet after 4 months on a jagged, rocky beach was a profound comfort. The gentle, rolling motion of the rescue ship was a soothing lullaby after the violence of the lifeboats and the harsh stillness of the island. And soon, the warm, inviting smell of hot soup being prepared in the ship's galley drifted up to the deck. It was the smell of salvation. For his part in this incredible rescue, Captain Luis Pardo is still, to this day, celebrated as a national hero in Chile. His bravery and humanity provided the final, crucial chapter in the story of the Endurance. With every single man of the expedition now safe and accounted for, their tale of survival became an instant legend. But their lives, of course, did not end there. We can now gently turn our thoughts to what became of these incredibly resilient men. After they finally returned to a world that had been completely transformed, a world that was now engulfed in the flames of the Great War, the men of the Endurance returned to a Britain that was deep in the midst of the First World War. For most of them, their sense of duty was unshakable. They had just survived one of the most grueling ordeals imaginable, yet they immediately volunteered for service in the armed forces. They traded the white battleground of the Antarctic for the muddy trenches and perilous seas of Europe. One of the first to go was Timothy McCarthy, the cheerful, indomitable, able seaman who had been one of the 6 men on the epic journey of the James Caird. He joined the Royal Navy Reserve and was assigned to an armed oil tanker less than a year after his miraculous rescue in March of 1917. His ship was torpedoed by a German submarine in the Atlantic. Timothy McCarthy was killed in action. He was the first of the Endurance crew to die, and the only one who did not die of natural causes. Frank Worsley, the master navigator, also put his incredible skills to use in the war. He was given command of a coup ship, a heavily armed naval vessel disguised to look like a harmless merchant ship designed to lure German U-boats to the surface. He became a celebrated submarine hunter, using his uncanny navigational instincts to track and destroy the enemy. He survived the war and lived a long life, always proud of his time on the Endurance. And then there was Tom Crean, the quiet Irish giant, a man of immense strength and gentle spirit. After the expedition, he returned to the Royal Navy for a short time before retiring. He went home to his small village of Anascall in County Kerry, Ireland. There, he married and opened a small pub. He named it the South Pole Inn. It's a lovely thought, to imagine the quiet clinking of glasses and the warm, friendly chatter in his pub. He rarely spoke of his Antarctic adventures, but the name of his establishment was a quiet, humble testament to the incredible journeys he had made. The peaceful sound of the wind, blowing through the green grasses of the Irish countryside near his pub, must have been a soothing contrast to the howling gales of the south. The story of Harry "Chippy" McNeish, the brilliant carpenter, has a more somber tone. For his brief moment of defiance on the ice, when he had questioned Shackleton's authority, he was denied the Polar Medal. the prestigious award given to almost every other member of the expedition. He returned to the merchant navy and sailed the seas for many more years. He eventually settled in New Zealand, where the gentle lapping of water against the ships in a quiet harbor would have been a constant companion. He fell on hard times and died in poverty. His incredible contributions to the survival of the crew not fully recognized until many years after his death. Perce Blackborough, the young stowaway whose sharp eyes were the first to spot Elephant Island, had suffered severe frostbite during his time there. The ship's surgeon had to amputate the toes of his left foot in a grim operation performed in their makeshift shelter. Despite his injury, he too served his country in the war, working on merchant ships. And what of Shackleton's two most loyal men? Frank Wild, his steadfast second-in-command, served in the war in northern Russia. After the war, when Shackleton decided to mount one last expedition to the Antarctic, Wild was, of course, right there by his side. Shackleton himself spent the years after the Endurance expedition trying to pay off its considerable debts. He went on a grueling lecture tour, recounting the story of their survival to packed halls. He also served in the army, undertaking a diplomatic mission to Russia during its civil war. But the pull of the South was too strong to resist. In 1921, he organized one final journey, the Shackleton Rowett expedition, aboard a small ship named the Quest. But his body, which had endured so much, was beginning to fail him. On the 5th of January, 1922, while the Quest was anchored off the coast of South Georgia, the very island that had been his salvation, Sir Ernest Shackleton died of a sudden heart attack. He was just 47 years old. His wife requested that he be buried there, on the island that he loved. And so, he rests in a simple, wind-swept cemetery in the old whaling station of Grytviken, a peaceful place for a man whose life was defined by restless exploration. The feeling of turning the page of an old book and reading of the final chapters in the lives of these men is a quiet and reflective experience. Their great adventure was over, and their individual paths led them back into the gentle stream of ordinary life and eventual peaceful rest. The men scattered, their individual stories continuing on their own quiet paths, but the expedition itself took on a life of its own. It became something more than just a memory for those who were there. It grew into a defining story, a powerful legend of human endurance that would echo through the coming century. In its most basic technical sense, the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition was a complete failure. It did not achieve its primary objective, which was to be the first expedition to cross the entire Antarctic continent from sea to sea. They never even set foot on the mainland of the continent they had intended to cross. And yet, it is remembered today not as a failure, but as one of the greatest triumphs of the human spirit. Shackleton's story is all about amazing leadership. He kept his crew together, boosting their morale through months of tough times and darkness. Legendary stuff, right? People study him in business schools today. His motto, "By endurance we conquer," really shows his spirit. He believed in optimism is true moral courage, and he made sure his men felt that too. Just imagine sitting in a cozy lecture hall, soaking in his unique and compassionate leadership style. His influence is still strong. The story is also a timeless lesson in the importance of teamwork. Every man had a part to play. The survival of the entire crew depended on the specialized skills of individuals. It depended on Worsley's genius for navigation and on McNeish's skill as a carpenter. It depended on the hunters who provided food, and on the doctors who tended to the sick and injured. It was a perfect, functioning ecosystem of shared responsibility. A huge part of the reason we can still feel so connected to this story is because of the work of Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer. His stunning, starkly beautiful black and white photographs provided a powerful and unforgettable visual record of their journey. Looking through a book of his images, the quiet rustle of the pages is like a whisper from the past. We can see the Endurance, proud and majestic, before she was trapped. We can see the pressure ridges of the ice and the faces of the men, etched with cold and with weariness, but also with hope. His images cemented the expedition's legendary status. The story of the Endurance stands in gentle contrast to some of the other polar expeditions of that era. It was a time known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, and while it was an age of great bravery, it was also often an age of tragedy. The story of Captain Robert Falcon Scott's expedition, which reached the South Pole only to perish on the return journey, is a heartbreaking tale. Shackleton's greatest success, the achievement that defines his legacy, was that in the end, he brought all of his men from the main party home alive. And so, the story has inspired countless books and films and documentaries. It has become a benchmark for survival stories, a representation of a turning point in exploration. It marks a shift from an age that was focused purely on geographical discovery to a new age that began to study the limits of human endurance and the quiet strength of the human heart. The gentle, abstract feeling of a story like this, settling into its place in history, becoming a timeless and peaceful legend, is a comforting thought. It rests now in our collective memory, a quiet hum in the background, like a peaceful exhibit in a silent museum, dedicated to the enduring power of the human will. For over a century, the story was complete, with just one significant missing piece. The ship that had started it all, the beautiful, tragic vessel that had been their home and their hope. The Endurance itself lay lost in the deep, silent, and unexplored waters of the Weddell Sea. Its final resting place was a complete mystery, the last unwritten paragraph in a legendary tale. For more than 100 years, she rested in that profound and silent darkness. Then, in the year 2022, an expedition was launched with a single goal: to find her. The search expedition, named Endurance 22, brought with it all the tools of modern technology. Using an advanced icebreaker and sophisticated underwater drones, they returned to the Weddell Sea. They returned to the last known position of the ship, the final coordinates so carefully recorded by Frank Worsley all those years ago, and in March of that year, they found her. The discovery was breathtaking. The wreck of the Endurance was located at a depth of nearly 10,000 feet, that is just over 3,000 meters, and she was resting just 4 miles from the final position that Worsley had calculated. His final act of navigation was, even in the ship's sinking, almost perfect. The images that were sent back from the deep were nothing short of miraculous. The wreck is astonishingly, beautifully well preserved. The extreme cold, the perpetual darkness, and the absence of the tiny, woody teen organisms that are common in other oceans had kept her almost exactly as she was the day she sank. The name of the ship, Endurance, is still clearly visible, spelled out in proud gold letters across her stern. A name that became a prophecy. She is sitting perfectly upright on the seabed. Her masts are down, but her hull is largely intact. It is a peaceful and deeply moving sight. The silent, slow drift of the submersible's light beam, cutting through the profound darkness of the deep sea, slowly revealed the ship's secrets. The remotely operated vehicles, the ROVs, glided over her decks. Their cameras captured incredible details: piles of crockery stacked in the galley, a pair of leather boots resting on the deck, and most hauntingly of all, the ship's wheel standing on the bridge, perfectly preserved, a gentle, ghostly image waiting for the hands of a helmsman who will never return. The quiet, excited hum of the control room on the research vessel far above, as these first incredible images appeared on their screens, must have been a sound of pure wonder. The wreck is now protected as a historic site and monument under the Antarctic Treaty. This means that nothing can be disturbed or touched or taken from her. She will remain as she is, an underwater museum, a memorial to the men who sailed on her. The discovery was celebrated by historians and by the descendants of the crew as a monumental achievement. It brought the story full circle. It provided a final, tangible, and deeply moving link to the past. And there she rests, in the silent, peaceful dark, a monument to the epic journey she started, and to the indomitable will of the men she carried. Her story, and their story, is now, finally, complete. It is a peaceful thought to end on, a quiet, beautiful echo from the past, resting forever undisturbed, deep beneath the Antarctic ice. I hope you are feeling deeply relaxed now. Our story is not quite over yet. Our story has reached its shore. The men are safe, their journey is over, and the echoes of their endurance have settled into the quiet pages of history. Now, with the tension behind us, we can allow our minds to drift back, to gently explore some of the quiet details, the fascinating science that made their survival possible. This is a time for calm reflection, a gentle exploration of the knowledge that guided them through the ice. Let us begin with the quiet art that kept them from being truly lost. Let us think about the incredible work of Frank Worsley and the beautiful science of navigational astronomy. In our modern world of satellites and screens, it is a peaceful thought to remember a time when our position on the vast ocean was found by looking up at the sun and the stars. The primary tool for this beautiful craft is the sextant. If you were to hold one, you would feel the smooth, heavy coolness of the brass in your hands. It is an instrument of elegant simplicity. Its purpose is to measure an angle. Specifically, it measures the precise angle between a celestial body, like our sun, and the line of the distant horizon. This angle is known as the altitude. But knowing this angle is only one half of the puzzle. The other, equally vital piece of information is the time. Not just any time, but the exact Greenwich Mean Time, the universal standard. This was provided by the chronometer. Imagine a small, exquisitely made clock nestled safely inside a padded wooden box. Its quiet, gentle ticking was the heartbeat of their navigation. This clock was wound carefully every single day, as its accuracy was absolutely critical to their survival. With these two pieces of data, the sun's angle and the exact time, a navigator can perform a kind of magic. He can draw a line on his chart, a line of position. He does not yet know exactly where he is, but he knows he is somewhere on that single, specific line. To find his true location, his fix, he simply needs to wait. He waits for the sun to move further across the sky, and then he takes another sight and calculates another line of position. Where those two lines intersect on the sea chart, that is where he is. It is a moment of quiet certainty, a small point of light in a vast and empty sea. Navigating in the polar regions, however, adds layers of gentle difficulty to this process. The sun, for much of the year, hangs low in the sky. It follows a long, shallow arc, which makes the angles harder to measure accurately. There are also long periods of twilight, where the horizon is dim and the sun is weak, a pale disk in the polar sky. And then there is the problem of the horizon itself. In the stormy Southern Ocean, the horizon is rarely a clean, steady line. It is a wobbly horizon, constantly rising and falling with the immense waves. Getting a precise angle in these conditions was almost impossible. So Worsley, with his immense patience, would take multiple readings and then calculate their average, a calm and methodical approach to a chaotic problem. He could not rely on his compass as he might in other waters. Near the Earth's poles, the planet's magnetic field becomes erratic and unreliable. The needle of a compass can swing wildly or point in the wrong direction. So the sun and the stars were his only true guides. Perhaps most remarkable of all was Worsley's ability to do the complex mathematics required. The calculations, a form of spherical trigonometry, were done by hand with a pencil on a scrap of paper, on the deck of a tiny boat being tossed by a storm. The mental image of these numbers and equations flowing peacefully across a page amidst the chaos is a testament to the power of his focused, disciplined mind. He did have help in the form of pre-calculated tables in a book called A Nautical Almanac, which reduced some of his workload. But the final calculations, the final act of finding their position, was all his. This beautiful method, a quiet blend of astronomy and mathematics, has been used by sailors for centuries. It is a peaceful reminder of our timeless connection to the sun, the stars, and the gentle, predictable motions of our universe. Worsley's mind and his mathematics kept them on their course. But it was the food they ate, the simple fuel they consumed, that powered their bodies and allowed them to endure the immense physical challenges of their journey. So let us now turn our thoughts to the simple, yet profoundly effective, science of their polar diet. In the vast, white wilderness of the Antarctic, there are no plants to eat. The entire ecosystem is built upon the ocean. And so, the men of the Endurance became a part of that ecosystem. Their primary source of food was the meat from the animals that lived on and around the ice. They hunted Weddell seals and crabiter seals and the small, determined Adelie penguins. This diet, though monotonous, was remarkably effective. The meat of these animals is extremely rich in protein, and especially in fat. This high fat content was essential. Fat provides a huge number of calories, the energy that the body needs. And in the extreme, unrelenting cold of the Antarctic, the men's bodies were like furnaces, constantly burning energy just to stay warm. They needed this dense, high-calorie food to survive. But there was another, even more crucial benefit to their diet. The great dread of sailors and explorers in this era was a terrible disease called scurvy. It is caused by a lack of vitamin C, and for centuries it had doomed countless expeditions, its effects slow, painful, and fatal. The men of the Endurance, however, never suffered from it. We know now that fresh meat, especially organ meat, contains small but vital amounts of vitamin C. By eating the meat fresh, they were unknowingly protecting themselves from this ancient curse of the sea. They were incredibly efficient in their use of the animals. Nothing was wasted. They ate not just the muscle meat, but also the organs, like the liver and the heart. These parts of the animal are particularly rich in vitamins and minerals, a hidden source of vital nutrition. It was a simple, intuitive wisdom, born of necessity. Their food was cooked on a small, simple stove, a clever invention that burned seal blubber for fuel. It was a smoky, greasy, and often smelly process. The rich, gamey smell of cooking seal meat would have filled their small, cramped shelters, but it was the smell of life. It was the smell of warmth. The meals themselves were often a simple, thick stew. They called it hush. It was a mixture of whatever meat was available, boiled with water, and sometimes thickened with crumbled pieces of sledging biscuit. The gentle, bubbling sound of this thick stew, simmering on their small stove, was a comforting, domestic sound in a profoundly wild place. The psychological effect of a hot meal in the freezing cold cannot be overstated. The warm, comforting feeling of a hot mug in frozen, numb hands, the sight of steam rising from a plate of food into the frigid air. These were moments of profound comfort, a simple ritual that provided a sense of routine and a sense of hope. When they were on the boat journey and fresh meat was scarce, they relied on their sledging rations. These were a type of hard, dense biscuit made from simple ingredients like flour, lard, and salt. They had a dense, crumbly texture and were not delicious, but they were packed with energy. This reliance on a simple, local food source, a diet taken directly from the environment around them, was a key to their survival. It was a quiet lesson in adapting, in living with the land, rather than just trying to conquer it. Their diet provided the fuel for their bodies, and their small shelters provided the means to survive. But of all the shelters they had, the most ingenious, the most important, was the little boat that took 6 of them across the ocean. It is a quiet and satisfying thought to reflect on the brilliant craftsmanship, the art of the shipwright, that made that journey possible. Let us take a moment to admire the work of Harry Chippy McNeish, the expedition's carpenter. The James Caird was a whaleboat, a beautiful craft, just over 22 feet long. It was designed to be double-ended with a pointed bow and stern, which made it highly maneuverable, perfect for chasing whales. But it was an open boat, never intended for the giant waves of the Southern Ocean. It was McNeish's job to change that, working in the freezing conditions on the shores of Elephant Island. With only a small, limited toolkit, he performed a small miracle of carpentry. The gentle, rhythmic sound of his saw cutting through wood, the satisfying, repeated tap of his hammer driving a nail home. These were the sounds of hope being built. His first and most important modification was to raise the sides of the boat. He raised the freeboard, as it is known, by about 18 inches. This would help the little boat to rise over the big waves, rather than being swamped by them. He then built a deck, a makeshift roof for the open boat. He used wood he salvaged from old packing crates and the long, thin runners from the sledges they had dragged across the ice. The sight of this wooden frame, slowly and carefully taking shape, must have been an incredible boost to the morale of all the men. This new deck was then covered with canvas, which he had to make as waterproof as possible. He used a strange but effective mixture of oil paints, saved by the expedition's artist, and the blood of the seals they had hunted. The rough texture of the canvas, being stretched taut over the new deck, was the skin of their new, more resilient shelter. McNeish's skill was not just in building, but in understanding. He knew the immense, powerful forces that the sea would exert on the little boat. He carefully strengthened the boat's keel, its spine, to help it withstand the constant battering. He reinforced the mast, so it would not snap in the hurricane-force winds. His design was a masterpiece of careful balance. The new deck had to be strong enough to keep the water out, but it also had to be light enough not to make the small boat unstable and top-heavy. Every decision was a life-or-death calculation. His work was a quiet, humble testament to the power of human ingenuity and the quiet pride of a master craftsman looking over his finished work. Years later, in 2013, a team of adventurers built a perfect replica of the modified James Caird, and they successfully recreated Shackleton's journey from Elephant Island to South Georgia. Their voyage confirmed what was already known. The modifications made by Chippy McNeish, with his simple tools and his profound understanding of the sea, were nothing short of brilliant. McNeish's work got them across the ocean to the shores of South Georgia, an island of incredible, stark beauty and of immense natural power. Let us end our long story here by peacefully exploring the geology, the glaciers, and the gentle, natural world of this final, beautiful island. South Georgia is a long, narrow, crescent-shaped island. It is a subantarctic island, which means it lies to the north of the Antarctic continent itself, in the warmer but still very cold waters of the Southern Ocean. It is, in fact, the very peak of a huge, submerged mountain range, a hidden continuation of the Andes Mountains of South America, which stretches down beneath the sea and links up with the mountains of the Antarctic Peninsula. The island is incredibly rugged and wild. It has 11 peaks that rise to over 2,000 meters high. It is a place of sharp, dramatic mountains and deep, shadowed valleys. And over half of the island is permanently covered in ice in the form of immense glaciers. The Fortuna Glacier, which Shackleton and his companions crossed, is one of the largest of these. These glaciers are like slow, silent rivers of ice, flowing imperceptibly from the high mountains down towards the sea. The island sits in a very special place in the world's oceans. It is just south of what is known as the Antarctic Convergence. This is a natural, invisible boundary in the sea, a place where the cold, dense waters of the Antarctic meet and sink beneath the warmer, lighter waters of the subantarctic. This mixing of waters churns up nutrients from the deep ocean, creating an incredibly rich and fertile environment. This richness supports a staggering amount of wildlife. The shores of South Georgia are home to some of the largest animal colonies on Earth, the site of a vast colony of king penguins, a living sea of black and white and flashes of gold, is a truly wondrous thing. Huge, lumbering elephant seals, their loud, barking calls, echoing along the stony beaches, breed here in their thousands. It is a vibrant, noisy, and thriving ecosystem. The glaciers on South Georgia are what are known as tidewater glaciers. This means that they flow all the way down to the ocean. As they reach the sea, huge chunks of ice break off or calve, forming small icebergs. The deep, sapphire blue of this ancient, compressed ice, visible in the deep cracks and crevasses of the glacier, is a sight of profound beauty. But these crevasses, often hidden by a thin blanket of snow, were what made the crossing of the island so incredibly dangerous. There are no native trees on this windswept island. The only vegetation that can survive the harsh conditions is a type of tall, hardy tussock grass and patches of soft mosses and lichens clinging to the rocks. The feeling of a gentle but persistent wind blowing across a wide field of this tussock grass is a peaceful and elemental sensation. Today, South Georgia is a protected area. The old whaling stations, like Stromness and Grytviken, have long since been abandoned. They are quiet now, slowly being reclaimed by the island's wildlife. The island is now a world-renowned center for scientific research, a living laboratory for understanding our planet's climate and its oceans. And here, amidst the peaceful, natural sounds of this wild and beautiful island, our story finally comes to its gentle and final close. From the crushing, grinding ice of the Weddell Sea to the silent, snowy peaks of South Georgia, we have followed a journey of almost unbelievable endurance. But now, there is nothing left to do but to rest. Let these quiet thoughts of vast, empty landscapes and the calm strength of the human spirit guide you now into a deep and peaceful sleep. Thanks for being with me tonight, your sleeping scribe. It's been great to share this quiet time with you, looking at Shackleton's amazing bravery and spirit on his journey across Antarctica. I hope learning about this incredible human effort gave you a peaceful moment and a better understanding of how strong people can be. If you liked our calm trip through history and found peace in our shared quiet time, your support is always welcome. A simple like, a nice comment, or subscribing to our community helps these calm trips into the past continue. Every action helps our small, peaceful place, making sure we can keep offering these special chances for calm, learning, and exploring. As our story finishes, I wish you the best and most peaceful dreams. May your night be calm, and may you wake up feeling refreshed and ready for whatever new things tomorrow brings. Good night.